Hey everyone, welcome back to On Purpose, the #1 health podcast in the world. Thanks to each and every single one of you that come back every week to listen, learn, and grow. Now, you know that we get this amazing opportunity to sit down with minds from the worlds of celebrity and music, all the way through to experts in their field and thought leaders, business leaders. And today's guest is someone that I've been wanting to speak to for a long, long time. I saw so many of her interviews. I read her book. She's a #1 New York Times best-selling author of a book called How to Do the Work. I highly recommend it. We'll put the link to the book in the comments so you can go and grab a copy. We've been DMing away, and she's finally here today. I'm talking about none other than Dr. Nicole LePera. Nicole, thank you so much for being here.
Jay, thank you for having me. I've been knowing you and your work, so the fact that our paths have crossed right now, it's truly an honor for me, so thank you.
Well, I was so happy to see the success of your book. And when I saw it come up, I literally saw everyone posting about it and everyone talking about it. And I just loved how clearly you've been articulating your message so effectively on Instagram all the way through to the book. And I'm so just happy, and congratulations on all the amazing success. It's fun to watch.
Thank you. It's wild even still to hear when I am intro that I have a book and this thing that obviously I dedicated so many hours of my life to. It's still hard to believe in a lot of ways. Even just the whole of this journey, I would have never imagined. I think it was July 2018 when I popped up my first Instagram square. I would have never anticipated, I should say, kind of the journey that it's been, though. It is an honor, and I'm grateful for every moment of it.
Well, you're helping people think about psychology in a completely different way, and holistic psychology. And can you share with us, when you say the work, describe to us what you define as the work. When you say how to do the work, what is the work from your perspective?
Yeah, so the work actually, kind of my concept of it really came out of the traditional way that I had once been working. So coming through a system where I was trained as a clinical psychologist, I had a practice, I had the clients that came in week after week. On my own side of the personal side of things, I struggled with anxiety. I think not a lot of us do, was in all of the different types of treatment. And what I saw several years into my practice was the #1 word that comes to mind was a stuckness. All of these humans, myself included, that had increasing amounts of insight, right? Awareness. Oh, I might even know where these patterns come from that no longer serve me. And I definitely might even have a plan of action to create change, to do something different the next time so that I obviously don't have to live those consequences. Yet what I would come to see, and with increasing amounts of frustration and even hopelessness, is that inability to, as I say, bridge that gap. Mm-hmm. So for me, the concept of the work, the title of the book, really kind of illuminates the fact that it does take numerous daily choices that we begin to make each day, and that there, of course, is a reason why so many of us are stuck. So from that really low point, I would go to kind of admit, even from my own personal life, and of course, being the hired healer in the room, the person who's supposed to impart these individuals with the tools, it was quite low. I really understood one of the reasons why. It's because we weren't working what I now call holistically. In the field, we really just kind of chopped off the mind. You kind of introed by saying we talked to these minds. I was giggling because our minds are attached to a body. And until we really understand that we are a whole person, in my opinion, a mind, body, and soul, so many of us are going to continue to remain stuck.
Mm-hmm. And so what actually brought you to extending that out? I think we're all grown up with, spiritually, we would call the bodily concept of life like this. You're engrossed in the bodily conception of life. When was it for you that you started to realize that we were more than this body and that we were affected by more than what happens to us physically? When was that for you, and how did that come about?
It was pretty much in real time with, my practice that was there, that existed. Because on the personal side of things, all of the tools that I thought I had weren't working. And I also started to kind of have breakthrough symptoms, for lack of a better word. Anxiety that was somewhat manageable was coming back again, feeling very unmanageable. And I actually started to have some physical symptoms. I started to faint. I had never had episodes of fainting. Started to forget my words mid-sentence, like beyond just, I think, the very natural, my thoughts wandered. It was a scary feeling. So it actually came in a moment of panic. When, like most of us do, I went online looking for what I was convinced at that point was probably something wrong in my brain. Yet at that point, I didn't have my why. Because when I revisited few memories of my childhood that I had, I didn't have those big glaring moments that I was taught in school might map on to memory issues or to the same symptoms, the peaks in anxiety that I was having. I didn't have any explanation. So I went online, like I said, as many of us do, searching for the medical thing that I was going to find wrong in my brain. And I actually was met with this whole new literature, specifically around epigenetics in particular, coming again from a system where I was taught your genes were it. You had the genetics that you were born with, and you really had limited ability to create change. So for me, hearing otherwise, hearing that, yes, of course, we're all born with genetic components, and then we have an environment which has multiple, aspects of it, the external events, the people around us that really do impact those genes. So I wouldn't say I believed in epigenetics at that point. It was an interesting theory. Like I say, it kind of just slightly opened the door that a very big part of me didn't feel was my story. Okay, this is great. All of these amazing stories I read. Oh, these humans create change, come back from incurable illnesses. I'm definitely going to be the person who that doesn't work for. Yet it at least opened the door of possibility. And then, of course, it took many daily small steps, as I call them, daily promises, that I kept in my own life to begin to find out how to utilize the environment around us, how to make different choices, and how to create change. So again, I would lie if I said, oh, that changed my world in one fell swoop and off I went. Absolutely not. I think us humans, we have to live the experience to believe it. However, it began my journey, because up until then, I was taught that door was closed. There was no possibility.
And for those that are new to the idea of epigenetics, can you break down for us what that is and how that's something someone can start to work on sitting from the comfort of their home?
Yeah, so epigenetics, does highlight the fact that we are all born and we have these inborn things, genetics, that are passed on through generations. However, it's the choices we're making. How much sleep are we getting? How much stress is in our environment? More in particularly, how much support do we have to deal with this stress? What are we eating? Are we getting the nutrients? And really the list goes on. And then an interaction between the genetic, components of us and those choices, then we start to see either symptoms, we get that diagnosis, we get that disease, if you will, or again, here comes the possibility that we don't. So the change begins, I always say, 2 parts to change. The one part is awareness, beginning to see from a conscious mind. I love how all of your work on presence, I couldn't agree more that it becomes the foundation for change. Many of us have to just learn how to see ourselves day in and day out, because most of us are living from our subconscious. We're living that autopilot. We're not even really aware. We might think we're getting more sleep than we are. We might think we're eating in a more healthy way than we are. So consciousness, right, creates that opportunity then to begin to make those new choices. So change, in my opinion, comes when we become conscious and then gift ourselves with choice. We make small interventions. We maybe try to sleep a bit more, try to navigate our stress differently, and then again, we can mitigate those symptoms that many of us are feeling stuck in.
Yeah, so it really is this 360-degree view of life. Like you've talked about everything from nutrition to sleep to the choices that we make. And you use this term in your book. You say like you're your own healer. This idea that you're the healer of yourself. I think for a lot of us, we often look outwards for healing.
Yes.
We hope that someone else will come and heal us. We go to our doctors, or we may even go to a guide. And tell me about that. The power in that statement is so true, but it's almost so hard to accept often. I know sometimes, even in myself, I'll get to the point where I'm like, oh, I just want to come change my life, right? Like we always have that feeling, like someone's going to come and find me and someone's going to come and change my life. And that, whether that's come from our childhood or wherever it is, how do you empower yourself with the belief truly that you are your own healer? And how do you really accept that? What does it take to really embrace that statement as something real?
Yeah, and I would agree with you. I mean, there were so many ways that I outsourced, as I say, my inner knowing. A lot of it is very conditioned. We're taught to do that. I could even make a big global statement that I think on the macro level, a lot of us in society, regardless of the culture you come from, are taught some level of that externalization, right? Whether you look to your religious sect or your family or, again, the doctor, there is someone I think that many of us have been taught taught from a very early age. Sometimes it's not even directly where we're, told this person knows better. Sometimes it's indirectly, or seeing our parent figures, our caregivers outsourcing their knowing to someone else, that then we begin to do the same thing. And I was one of those people. I mean, one might even say I was trained in a profession to be that outsourced guide for someone else. And it never sat well for a couple of different reasons. It did feel very, it kind of continued to precipitate this disempowerment, this idea that someone else knows better. And it actually brought up a question for me, which is, how could someone else know better when they didn't live our life? They don't make sense of things the way our minds make sense of things. And I learned very early on in my training that it is natural for us to assume, to hear somewhat of a similarity between maybe my story and if you were to share with me your story, and then to assume a much greater similarity. Yeah. Oh, you said anxiety. I have that. So you must have the exact same version I do.
Yes.
And I learned very early on in my clinical training, or it was suggested to me not to do that, because we could be using the same words. We could think we mean the same things, but there's so much individual variation. So now going back to this concept of this person outside of me who has that intimate awareness of me, and or who's able to show up as me in those given moments. I mean, now it gets really silly logistically, right? No, I'm me. I need to navigate the next time that happens. So I need those tools. Peeling it back, I believe that sense of knowing, that healer, is the state that we're all born into. I do believe that we're a full, whole being, worthy even with our essence, or that thing that makes us our purpose, that we can then live out into the world, and then our conditioning happens. And now here comes in that onion analogy, right?
Yes.
All of the layers start to form around us, and then we become an adult who isn't living from that pure state, and again, who might have been conditioned to look outside of ourselves. So for many of us, it begins as a concept. I'm sitting here telling you, it's internal, peel back. For many of us, it becomes, when we take that first step, that begins a journey of many steps, because change, of course, doesn't happen like a light switch, like I call it. Like many of us want to, right? I flip the switch and now I'm different. Though the more we empower ourselves through that consciousness to create that change, then we can begin to embrace that reality that we can be the healer, that we can make choices that honor our best interests, and then that kind of peel back those layers and bring us back to that state of wholeness. So again, it begins as a theory, as all things do, until you begin to empower yourself to create these changes in your life. Yeah,
you mentioned self-awareness a few times there, and the idea of inner knowing and self-knowing. I find that, and this is what you're speaking about, the theory versus when it turns into reality. But I find that, don't you think so many of us sometimes we're like, I know when I do that, I know what I need to change. And it's not even about shifting it to action. It's like there's this almost, it feels like an instinctive pull to do the opposite, right? And it's so strong. And from a spiritual point of view, it's described as lust, and not lust for someone you're attracted to, not in such a gross way, but lust in the sense of this unflinching reaction, pendulum swing that's pulling you away from where you truly want to be. Tell us what's happening there. Why is it that we know that we need to eat this right, healthy food, but we are so attracted to the unhealthy food? We know we should be waking up earlier and sleeping earlier to get better quality sleep, but we're not doing that. What is that pull that's kind of just holding us back almost? It feels like someone's literally grabbing us by the collar and pulling us back.
Absolutely. And you used the word in your description there, instinctive. And I would go ahead and argue that it's outside of our awareness, and it feels very alluring in all of the ways. We might even have really high feelings, almost as if we can't resist it. We are rendered choiceless.
Yes, that's it. That's the best. Yeah.
And that's real. I mean, you described the reality that many of us are living, and that would describe that stuck place that I was referencing earlier. And like I said, that, in my opinion, when we continue to bear witness to, here's that old habit again, and now I'm living the consequences, here they come again, many of us begin to feel shameful. Right? We might even have well-meaning loved ones that are looking over our shoulder, wondering, why the hell we're continuing to do this, also continuing to increase our shame. And some of us now even begin to entertain these ideas that maybe I am broken. Maybe there is something just at my core that's creating this. And what is at all of our core as humans is the desire to remain in the familiar. right? And so what happens, and again, our familiar, all of the things that have happened to us beginning at a very early stage I like to talk about the brain and kind of what actually happens, begins to lay down pathways, quite literally, neurons, right, that fire together, wire together. So what happens is we have all of these very rote, very patterned ways of being that many of us have been rehearsing since birth, right? We always do that same thing. Usually, again, this begins out of pain, out of experiences where we've had to adapt, right? The things that we're doing come from a certain place. Yes, they might have some long-term consequences, but usually in the immediate, we were avoiding something, some form of pain, some form of discomfort, and or we were attempting to feel loved, to feel connected to our immediate family or the people around us, the people who were in charge of meeting our needs. However, we repeat and repeat and repeat, and then those pathways get really strong. So then we come, say, to, we decide we want to change. We've lived these consequences long enough. We see some sort of helper, or we read a book, and we have a new game plan of action. Now we're, again, using a different part of our mind. We're in that conscious part of our mind. However, that drive to that familiar is still there. It lives in our subconscious, and it's very strong. So what happens, as I put it, is we meet that resistance, either that overwhelming feeling, that drive, that compulsion, like you described it. Some of us, it just stays in our thinking mind. All of the reasons why this isn't going to work. It's so silly. You should stop doing this. Before long, if I listen to either of those things, the thoughts I'm thinking or the feelings I'm having that are new, that are unfamiliar, before long, I am back in those ruts. And it's not because I feel good, it's because I feel like I'm used to feeling. And anything out of those bounds can feel threatening. A lot of our stuckness, again, is coming from that drive to safety. The reality that the unfamiliar, according to our subconscious, is threatening because we don't actually know what comes next. So those patterns are what is safest, keeping us, again, stuck in those patterns.
Yeah, it's crazy how it works. I mean, I was reading I've read the studies that say you have 60 to 80,000 thoughts per day.
Wild.
80% of them are negative, and 80% of those are on repeat. And it's the repeat part that really makes me go, wow, we need to drive a train through this, or we need to somehow break this pattern because this pattern will just keep repeating and keep cycling and keep strengthening. And so we need to slowly weaken the pattern. I wanted to ask you that. Is it that we slowly chip away and weaken the pattern, or do we need something big like a freight train to come drive through it? Which one is it? And is it both? Is it neither? Is it, what's the process?
So the pathway to change, the kind of what happens, can happen, a slow, gradual descent, as happened for me. I gradually went across life. I checked all of the boxes that I thought were going to make me happy. There wasn't a cataclysmic moment when I was 28 or whenever this began that kind of initiated it. It was slow and gradual. Some of us are initiated into change when something cataclysmic happens. We lose the relationship. Life does shift and change. So both ways can be pathways in. The pathway through change, I think, is slow and gradual because what happens, again, because we're always looking to create safety, overwhelming change, changing our life from top to bottom between now and tomorrow could send us right back into that same adaptive mechanism that we've learned at one point to keep us safe. Now, this isn't to say that people listening haven't had success changing lives from top to bottom, of course. Though when we're working with the principles of the subconscious, our drive to stay in that familiar, it's those gradual victories because what we're looking to do is create the consistent habit. Like I was referencing earlier, there is no light switch. There's no making these new choices, here, there, maybe this week, maybe not next week. We want to integrate these new choices into our habit, into now what we do, how we eat, how much we sleep. So consistency is key. Smaller choices are much easier to maintain consistently than 5 or 10 new things all at once.
Yeah, one of the things, I'm just thinking about this because it's been something I've been doing recently. So during my time as a monk, we did a lot of tough physical austerities. And what I found through all of that is that my mind strengthened, but my body decided not to want those physical austerities again. And so I for a while I just was like, nah, I'm good. Like I'm good. And then more recently I've started, it was actually because one friend forced me to do a cold plunge and then do jump out of a plane and go skydiving. And so when I did that, I was like, oh, and I did it because of this friend. I was like, I want to do it with him. It'll be fun. And so when I did it, it broke through an old trauma pattern, an old barrier that was in my mind, which was I don't like physically difficult things anymore because I did so many. And when I say so many, I mean things like we would sleep on cold floors. We'd wake up often if we were traveling in puddles this high, like we would, you'd be sleeping in extreme hot and cold without even thinking about it. You'd go days without eating. Like there were a lot of things that we did that were great for my mind, but for my body struggled. And so now I've started trying to do, after I had that breakthrough, so I needed to do something as radical as that, like skydiving, to feel like I could go beyond that physical discomfort. And recently I got reintroduced to, so what I found was I was like, oh wow, I had a breakthrough. And then 4 months have gone by and someone was like, do you want to do a cold plunge? And I was like, no way. And all of a sudden I was back to that old pattern. And I went again and I broke it. And then now I've been going every week. And not only am I spending longer in the cold, I'm feeling more comfortable in it. I'm understanding how I can use my breath work and meditation in the cold. And what's been fascinating for me is I'm like, I want to go every week on purpose. Because if I go every week, then that's no longer a fear anymore. And I see every week that my time gets longer, my breath gets better. I'm able to heat my body by breathing because of my breath work. I'm starting to see the power of my mind and my breath work over my body in those scenarios. So what I'm saying is I can relate to what you're saying. And that's been something very real for me in the last few months that I've been working through. But you talk a lot about these old, deep-rooted traumas and how they block us. How do we uncover the root of a trauma? I find like so often we're dealing with the branches or the leaves or the fruits of a trauma, the negative fruits, the poisonous fruits. How do you figure out what the root of a trauma is?
Yeah, really good question. I was giggling when you were sharing all of that because I very much, my body, I run.
Yeah.
I did not have all of that training in doing difficult things, though I was an athlete and still, and I share this often within my community, that first thought when I go on that hike, that the elevation starts right from the beginning. I'm not even 20 steps in. I'm like, maybe I don't really want to be hiking today. And just for me in that moment, identifying that's the old voice.
Yes.
And I can gift myself with choice, I can choose to say, you know what, my body is fatigued right now and I will listen to it, or I can identify it as being, that old voice. So getting to a root of trauma, speaking of voices, a lot of the voices we are hearing, like you said, those negative voices in our head, the very patterned ones, the habitual ones, I call them, those are stories. They can be a big indicator of the root of trauma in a sense. So to be clear, because I am asked often, do we have to know, So the gist of this question is there an uncovering? Do we have to go back to that moment or those many moments that began this trauma? And I'm often asked, because when I share my story, part of it includes a large absence of those early memories, of really memories up until the more recent past for me. So reviewing my childhood for me in that kind of movie screened way to find the root is quite difficult because I don't have those. So, the natural question that follows is, if I can't find the exact root, can I heal it? Yeah. So while I'll say those stories are helpful, those patterns, those reactions, reactions that we have, those activating moments, they can all give us clues to actually have the particular moment in all of its details is, in my opinion, not possible for some of us and not necessarily fully necessary for others, because what we can work with is the pattern we're stuck in because it contains it, right? The book, The Body Keeps the Score, was one of the first, offerings of this idea, this concept that our body is remembering. So even if my mind, can't put on that movie and say, oh, that's where it began to happen, my body is reenacting it in a moment that's similar to that moment. So our start point can be, what are those patterns, right? If I can drop into my mind, first becoming aware of how busy it is, how many thoughts are running through it, and then I can begin to watch. And most of us will begin to see the story that we've made of us, the story that we've made of our relationships, our path in life, whatever it might be. The patterns is where we want to begin our exploration. And again, we can just start with, where are we stuck, right? What happens when I feel a really big emotion? That's a great place to begin looking. Oftentimes, that's something interpersonal, right? That happens in our relationships when I start to feel something really big, and then we can drop in, okay, what is the story I've told? Myself about this really big thing. What am I doing, right, to create safety in this moment? And then, of course, can I begin to make new choices? So to get to the root, we can start where we are, and we can start in those very patterned ways of things that we can see ourselves day in and day out. Once we're watching with consciousness, where we're becoming stuck, that can be our entry point for the work.
Got it. That makes a lot of sense. Thank you for clarifying that. I think that's such a great distinction between the root and the pattern, and the recognition that you don't need to do that if you can't, and it's not possible, and that's not going to stop you from healing, which I think is going to be so good for so many people to hear, because I think you can almost get lost in the trap of like, where did this start? Where was that moment? Was it this? Was it that? And that can just debilitate you even more, I guess. So.
And ultimately, the knowing of the story still remains in our thinking mind, right? I can go back and maybe even just tell the story, as sometimes our therapy does. It offers like this continuous just telling of my story. But again, kind of bringing this whole conversation full circle, until I learn how to embody a new response in that moment, my story remains in my mind, right? So even unearthing the cause of it won't shift then how my body reacts in that moment, won't allow me to then integrate a new feeling or make a new choice so that I can actually create change.
Got it. That makes sense. What are some of the practices and methods that you've used, learned, ones that you've shared with people, practical things that people can do that you think have really moved the needle for people in this regard? Whether that's awareness of a trauma, whether that's starting the healing process. What have been some of your favorite ones? I'm intrigued.
Yeah, so I think the most impactful one is the one that keeps coming up with that idea of consciousness. First being becoming aware of how unconscious many of us are living. By now, we've all heard the word autopilot. We all know that upwards of 90% of our day, we're in it. it becomes really impactful when you actually see it, right? When you see yourself no sooner opening your eyes and shifting right into that same thing you do first thing every morning, right? Being able to bear witness from the conscious mind creates, in my opinion, the greatest impact. Because what most of us see is how unconscious we are, how we're not even giving ourselves the opportunity to make a new choice because we're not there. We're not in the present moment. We're not able to shift our attention from wherever else it might be. For many of us, it's lost in our thinking mind.